Hello Megamaniacs and welcome back to the Retro Hunting Adventures. Today is Compilation Day. I picked up 4 different games that are compilations of games and one game that was so weird and so cheap that I couldn't resist getting it at the price. Stay tuned and we'll dig further into these games after some opening words from MegaManFan.
Yo, this is MegaManFan, and you need to rock and or roll on over to Mr. MegaManFan's YouTube channel, because it's all that rush to make it happen. Peace!
Now, obviously, this copy of Arcade's Greatest Hits for Sega Saturn is not in the greatest of conditions. The case is cracked all up and down, scuffed everywhere. The hinges are missing, but it is an original Sega Saturn case, and it is complete with the manual, and the disc is in acceptable condition. So for the price, I decided I could buy it and swap it out with a Madden game and have a nicer case for the game once I was done with it. So it all works out in the end. Switching between the games on the Sega Saturn is relatively painless and only takes a few seconds to load one game after another, and it is a nice selection of vintage arcade games for those of us who grew up going to arcades to play these games because they weren't even available on home consoles at the time, or if they were severely limited compared to the arcade versions. It wasn't at least until the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis that you could get near perfect arcade ports. You could get some decent ones on NES and Sega Master System, sometimes surprisingly excellent ones on systems like Atari 2600 that really had somebody putting in the effort behind them, but it was the 16-bit, 32-bit era where near arcade perfect conversions started to come home, and these are very good conversions. The Sega Saturn Arcade Classics Collection Atari Volume 1 is what I would call faithful and fun to play. I would say there's a better version of Centipede coming up later in this video, but I would not complain about the quality of the games they included here. I feel like they did a good job. Unfortunately, despite calling it Volume 1, there was no Atari Volume 2, and that's due to poor sales of the Sega Saturn in North America compared to other territories, but I don't think there's an Atari Volume 2 in Japan either. I think they just decided they were done with it. I don't remember a Volume 2 of Atari Arcade Classics coming out on anything in the era, because it wasn't just limited to Sega Saturn, nor was it even limited to just Atari. There was a Midway Arcade Classics, there was a Williams Arcade Classics. There were a lot of these, but if any of them got beyond Volume 1, I'm not recalling it off the top of my head. But Centipede is one of my all-time favorite video games, computer games, arcade games, even handheld standalone games, except maybe for that miniature one that looks like an Argy Boy but is just Centipede, Missile Command, and Pong. If you saw my review of that, you'll note that I said it really lacks for sound and graphics, but they did the best they could on something that small. There was no shortage of effort here in adding extra features. As you can see, we've got video and audio.
Wonderful things about having been at Atari during that period of time of the late 70s, early 80s was...
That's what makes a difference on arcade compilations like this, when they go and interview the creators and really jazz it up. But speaking of jazz, wow, Kokoto Fishing Master is an incredibly jazzy looking game for only $2.99. I had to find out what this was about. It's just bizarre looking from the cover alone. I'm guessing it didn't sell very well, or it wouldn't be so cheap. It's obviously not rare or in demand either. There's a million fishing games. I don't think the PlayStation 2 needed any more, and they tried to buff this one even though I asked them not to, so hopefully it still works when we put it in the old PS2. Good news, it does work. Bad news, it's so obscure that when I tried to look up Kokoto Fishing Master on Wikipedia, it redirected me to Neko Entertainment. Ahem. Neko Entertainment was, past tense, a French video game developer located in the suburbs of Paris, founded in 1999. Neko's products are based on an evolutionary development platform for 3D consoles called the Neko Game Development Kit. Wow, hyperbole much? Neko was licensed to develop for 3DS, Game Boy Advance, GameCube, Nintendo DS, etc., etc., etc. So they went defunct back in 2017. And some of their hits, I use this term loosely, include the infamous Charlie's Angels for GameCube, Crazy Frog Racer for PlayStation 2, Arthur and the Invisibles for Nintendo DS, Legend of the Dragon for Nintendo Wii, and Bratz Kids Slumber Party for Nintendo DS. Do you get the idea of what we're talking about here? They made a lot of shovelware, and not very good at that. I probably would have given this game more of a chance if the little guide character hadn't told me to go find the hermit to learn more. And then when I tried to sail to the first island I could see, it immediately threw up an invisible wall and wouldn't let me. So let's move on to Atari Flashback Classics Volume 1 for Xbox One. Now, if the name rings a bell, these are spawned from the Atari Flashback Retro consoles, which are of varying degrees of quality. A couple are decent, some are good, a lot of them are not so great. So you will notice that AtGames is involved here. But fortunately, on these compilations for Xbox One, PS4, etc., the emulation is good to above average. I would say in most cases it's enough close that I don't really notice the difference, which isn't always true with the flashback standalone consoles that aren't compilations for video game consoles of modern era. When they do the standalone units, they often use the NES on a chip, which makes for some weird effects when you're trying to play Atari games running on what is essentially Nintendo hardware, but they did it on the cheap, so they didn't care. They just wanted to pump out the flashbacks and sell them as plug-and-play devices for people who were hungry for nostalgia. There are a couple that are above the average, though, including one that actually uses an Atari VCS on a chip and can even be modded to put a cartridge port on it to run authentic Atari 2600 cartridges. So if you're really wanting to do a deep dive into Atari flashbacks, there are plenty of resources out there. But if you want to do a deep dive into the Atari Flashback Classics Volume 1 or 2, you just get redirected to the Atari Flashbacks page if you're using Wikipedia, so you should probably go somewhere else. And of the versions of Centipede I've played today, I actually like this one a little better than the Sega Saturn version. Not just because of the wraparound graphics, which are a nice touch, but the video just seems a little bit sharper and clearer. I mean, that's obviously partially due to HDMI output, but I think it's also better rendered compared to the Sega Saturn. The pixels just feel sharper and clearer. The sound seems a little more accurate to me. Maybe that's just my perception, but it just feels like AtGames actually got it right with these home console versions as compared to the standalone plug-and-play consoles. So sometimes you gotta give the devil their due, even if that devil is AtGames. They don't get everything wrong. In fact, Mad Little Pixel will tell you that their pinball table is actually quite good, so I take his word for that. He's not usually wrong about these things, and if I had room for an AtGames pinball table, I'd probably have one too, but there is literally no place to put it. And unless I get a bigger house, there won't be. So that's part of the reason retro compilations are a good thing for a lot of people, because if you want to play a lot of games and you don't have a lot of space, they certainly get the job done. Space Duel has always been kind of weird to me. Even Wikipedia will tell you it's a direct descendant of Asteroids, but to me it more feels like a clone of Asteroids. Like they decided shooting at rocks was no longer going to be enough for Atari consumers, so Let's give them vector graphics with multicolors and funky shapes, and maybe they'll be into it more. Well, you won't get that on a collection of Activision classic games for Atari 2600. No vector graphics here, just your standard chunky Atari VCS Atari 2600 graphics, but with a series of games that did the best they could to push the limits of that modestly powered system, because Activision was really, really skilled at exploiting what that underpowered console could do, which is why their games have maintained a reputation over the years, and they're still fun to go back and revisit. I will say, though, that on PlayStation 1, these are not necessarily the ideal versions of Activision classics. Dare I even say that on the Game Boy Advance, which isn't a super high-powered system itself, the Activision classics on that feel much more faithful to Atari VCS Atari 2600 than the versions do here. Hero just instantly bugged me right away because the sound is not right. The color palette doesn't seem well matched. Generally speaking, Stella is not a hard emulator to get running on just about any computer or home console, but for whatever reason, the version they're using here either isn't Stella or isn't well tuned to the PlayStation 1 because it just feels off to me. And I wish it didn't, because Hero is a very classic cavern exploring game where you rescue trapped people and shoot bats and snakes and blow up walls with dynamite, and it's just a ton of fun to play in any way you can play it on any compilation, even if the graphics and sound don't match what you remember from the Atari 2600. If you didn't have any memory of that and just played this as is, you'd be thinking, wonderful, this is a fun game. It's simple but fun, and Hero is fun anytime you play it. ColecoVision, Atari, Activision Classics, so is Megamania for that matter. I know I'm Mr. MegaManFan, so there's an obvious pun there. In fact, my friend CPU Wiz even once produced a Megamania label that said MegaManFan on it, so I'm sure the card he sent it to me on was probably a Megamania that had the classic Actiplaque problem, which is where the glue just destroys the label over time. It was so cheaply produced that it leaves stains all over the label that look like a kid who had just been eating a slice of pizza, picked up the cartridge with his greasy fingers and totally smudged and ruined the labels. But no, almost all Activision carts end up looking like that over time. That's why it's called Actiplaque, because that glue just wears right through the label. The final compilation is Touchmaster, but I'm not going to include any footage of it for one reason. When it says 23 mini games, it really means that. These are not classic games. These are not arcade conversions. These are literally the kind of mini games you can play on a cell phone for free, and there's little worth showing off here except for the fact that this is complete with the Nintendo Wi-Fi manual, the Nintendo Health and Safety manual, and the actual manual for the game itself. So getting all of that complete in the case for $3, I consider to be worthwhile, especially given that these days you're seeing more and more loose Nintendo DS games, which I've never understood since they came in a case that held everything. Why did people throw the case away? I always complain about that, and I will never not be annoyed by that, because games that came in cases should have stayed in those cases. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. This is the Retro Hunting Adventures. Thank you for watching.